I would like you to imagine first that you're scuba diving in the ocean and that the water is blue and clear and beautiful. And then all of a sudden you see a shark. So how do you respond? Your heart might be beating really fast. You might want to try to escape, right? If you have a weapon on you, you might want to try to kill it. And then what happens if you're not just a scuba diver, but a marine biologist, and you happen to know that the shark in front of you is not anything too scary, but a reef shark that's about as threatening as a little dog? Your perception might change, right? You might approach that shark with a little more curiosity. And then what happens if you know that that particular shark is in danger of extinction? All of a sudden your heart opens up and you're filled with tenderness and with empathy and with compassion. So the way you initially thought of conflict is the way most of us generally approach conflict, right? We think of it as something unpleasant and scary. We respond to it with aggression, with defensiveness, right? And so today what I want to do is start shifting our perception on that conflict shark from that of the scuba diver to the marine biologist. And just the way the marine biologist has the knowledge and the tools to respond that way to her conflict shark, I want to offer you a tool as well to respond to yours similarly. And that tool is called listening. But it's not just listening the way we usually practice it, meaning I listen to your arguments in order to win them, right? We know that much. I'm talking about a different kind of listening, core-to-core listening, compassionate listening. And it's that quality of listening that has the capacity to heal our relationships, our communities, and the world. I first became interested in conflict resolution growing up in Israel, and being raised in a conflict-ridden place made me think a lot about why we fight and really how we can do it better. And I ended up spending a lot of time with that question. And one of the things I learned was that one of the main reasons for conflict was best articulated by author Anais Nin, who said, "We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are." And by that, I think she meant that when something happens, when a conflict happens, we tend to see it from our own context. And it's very, very difficult for us to see it from any other perspective. So I want to share with you a little bit about my perspective on conflict and hopefully illustrate that point a little bit. So one of my earliest memories as a child growing up was standing in our apartment in Tel Aviv and looking at my father, who was standing here with me in the living room, and he was wearing military uniform. And I remember looking up thinking that he was probably the strongest man in the world, right? I was 3. The year was 1982, and my dad was a first lieutenant in the artillery forces, and Israel was at war with Hezbollah guerrilla forces in Lebanon. And that was my first memory of conflict, and certainly not the last. When I was 15, I remember there was a lot of tension between Israel and Palestine. There were huge bombings that swept all through Israel's major cities. And I remember taking public transit to school at the time and feeling really scared, sitting on the bus and thinking that things might go wrong, the bus might explode, and just hoping that I'd get to school safe, right? It was a very scary time. And then when I was 18, I joined the military. Military service in Israel is compulsory. And I was sent to Lebanon to essentially continue fighting the same war that my father's generation had started. And we would get bombed on a regular basis, once every 2 days or so. And just judging by the way I still respond to firecrackers, to fireworks, to all that stuff, I suspect that I still retain a certain level of low-grade PTSD. You know, those experiences really stay in your body. So we'll see how we'll do Saturday night. That'll be interesting. So, and just to be clear, there's experiences on both sides of the conflict, right? There's pain and there's suffering on both sides. These just happen to be mine. And being exposed to such experiences really affects the way you view the world. It affects the way my country views the world. And I think of it as some kind of a matrix, right? And by matrix, I mean the histories, the beliefs, the stories that together create the space from which we perceive reality and out of which we respond. And I like the word matrix because it suggests a physical space, right? Something you're really enveloped in. And so when I think about the Israeli matrix, the words of Jean Knudsen-Hoffman, the originator of compassionate listening, come to mind. And she said, perhaps every act of aggression stems from an unhealed wound. And so reflecting on these words and on the Israeli matrix, I think of a country that was born in the aftermath of the Holocaust, right? Huge collective trauma, real threat of annihilation for European Jews. And then after that, every act of violence, every conflict, every war is judged and perceived from that matrix. And every conflict rubs against that wound and triggers it. So we can think of the whole country as a country that suffers from some level of PTSD as well, right? But then something else happens, and this is important. There's a study that was conducted a few years ago in which Jewish volunteers were asked to think about Palestinian suffering. And some of them were reminded of the Holocaust before doing that, and some of them were not. And it turns out that the ones who were reminded of the Holocaust had a more challenging time empathizing with Palestinian suffering. And this, by the way, is not just an Israeli or a Jewish phenomenon, it's a human phenomenon, right? American subjects responded the same way. When they were reminded of American trauma, even past trauma, distant trauma like Pearl Harbor, it was more challenging for them to identify and to empathize with, say, victims of torture. And so, what does it tell us? When we experience pain, when we experience trauma, our vision becomes polarized. And we start seeing the world in us versus them values, right? And we start thinking of our pain, experiencing our pain and our trauma as the only truth. And we lose sight of the fact that someone else on the other side has also experiences of pain and probably another truth. And then when we do that, we start losing sight of the fact that there's suffering. And when we lose sight, when we're not able to empathize with someone else's suffering, we lose sight of their humanity. And when we lose sight of their humanity, we lose sight of ours. And this is what we do collectively, right? But not just collectively, we do it personally too, on an individual level, right? Just the other day, we were packing, my partner and I, to come to Burning Man, and I'm kind of a task person, right? And I want everything to be really organized, and so we're packing, and I have all these lists, and then my partner is a lot more nonchalant about the whole thing, and he, as far as he's concerned, he could just throw a sarong in his satchel, and he's ready to go, and so he keeps saying, "Oh, we're ready to go, it's fine, I could leave tomorrow, it's super easy, we're ready," and at some point I turned to him and I'm like, "Baby, I feel like you're not taking responsibility, like you're not helping me out." And then he turns to me and he's like, "Well, you're stressing out too much, right?" All of a sudden, in 2 sentences, 2 narratives, polarization, right? With all the judgments associated with them as well. You're not taking responsibility, you're stressing out too much, right? And usually we add a bunch of blame on top of that as well. I'm not stressed, you're stressing me out, right? That kind of thing. I don't know if it sounds familiar to anyone. So, right. So, so we do it all the time, collectively and personally. So how do we begin to shift? How do we become less entrenched in our own truth? And how do we become more comfortable with contradictions, with nuances? How do we stop seeing our truth as the only truth for the sake of our own pain? How do we cultivate an identity that can host multiple truths? So I want to tell you about another conversation I had with my partner. I think it was a little more successful. And we were on a road trip, and that was a few months ago. So it's the heat of the primaries, and we're talking Sanders and Clinton and Trump and all that stuff. And it's a very passionate conversation. Who's better than who, and who's going to win, and who has better chances, and all that stuff. And at some point, he turns to me, and he's like, okay, that's enough. It's unproductive. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I want to stop. It's unproductive. Let's stop. Right? Kind of like just barks at me. And I'm totally taken aback and feeling really triggered. I mean, if there's one thing you probably know about me at this point, is that conversations and politics is what I live and breathe those things. And I'm sitting there and I'm feeling really silenced and triggered and like, what? Am I destined to live my life with this person who can't even hold his side of the conversation? And this is really important to me, and I need to have my needs met, and it's really important to set boundaries, and I'm feeling like really, really heated. And I'm about to say something, right? And then luckily I stop for a second and I take a deep breath and I remind myself that I might want to try to practice what I preach, right? And so I turn to him and I say, baby, I hear a lot of anger and a lot of frustration in what you just said. And can you tell me more? And he turns to me and he says, you know, I'm just so frustrated and sad by the political system, by how corrupt and rigged it is, and I have my own debt, and I feel like I can't get ahead, and it makes me so frustrated and so deeply sad. And at that point, my heart just completely opened up. And his defensiveness disappeared as well, right? And at that moment, I thought to myself, wow, there's nothing more disarming than being heard. And not only was it disarming for him, it was also transformative for me. All of my pain, all that story, all of my matrix, I was able to set it aside and dissolve it, right? It was a beautiful, beautifully transformative experience. And so one of the principles of compassionate listening is that everyone has the right for partial truth, right? Not just me with my pain. And it's a truth that extends beyond facts and beyond our judgments and beyond our blame. It's a fact, it's a truth of feelings. It's a truth of your pain, of your suffering. And it's also the truth of the essence that lies underneath those feelings. Why is this so important? What are the values that are being shaken? Why is this so triggering? Why does it elicit all these pains? And when we start listening for that truth, the truth of feeling and essence, then things really begin to change and open up. Compassionate Listening the founder of the Compassionate Listening Project, Leah Green, has been organizing delegations to Israel and Palestine since the 90s, right? And when you go on those delegations, you meet people on the front line who are actively working to start diffusing those boundaries, right? And start incorporating more and more truths. And so you meet with people like Father Emil Shufani, who's a Christian Palestinian living in Nazareth. And he received the UNESCO Peace Prize in 2003 because he realized one day that nothing will ever change between Israel and Palestine until Palestinians begin to understand the Holocaust and Jewish suffering. And so what he did was he organized a delegation of 300 people, Israelis and Palestinians, to go to Auschwitz and to walk in the camp and to start having that experience shift those boundaries that both groups are so invested in. Or you meet someone like Rabbi Nachman Fruman, who is actually one of the founders of a settler project in the West Bank, a very unlikely practitioner of compassionate listening. And one day, Rabbi Fruman writes a letter to Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who is the founder of Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Party, who is in power of Gaza. And he writes to him and he says, maybe if we want to start healing our people, and if we want to see at some point peace between Israel and Palestine, maybe we should connect. And maybe we should get together and talk about our mutual love for Allah and God. And so he does that. He goes to Gaza. And Yassin at the time was in prison, Israeli prison, and he goes to prison and he meets with Yassin. And then in 97, after his release, he goes to his house in Gaza and meets with him again. And now Fruman says that every time that he meets with Palestinian leaders, they talk about their love and for God and Allah first, and religion, and comparing Quran to the Bible. Then they talk logistics. And the feelings of affinity and trust run so deep that in 2009, during another war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, Fruman was able to negotiate the basis of a peace agreement with Hamas leaders and deliver it to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So the opposite of conflict is not peace. The opposite of conflict is listening. And it's listening from your heart. It's listening with compassion. And there's actually a lot of really beautiful research now coming out on the heart and compassion. We know now that the heart extends this electromagnetic field outside of your body, and it can actually be detected by sensitive devices. And that electromagnetic field is affected by our own emotions and our own feelings. And the highest frequency, the strongest electromagnetic field, is the one associated with feelings of love and compassion. But the wackiest thing is that that electromagnetic field has the capacity to change the other person's electromagnetic field as well. So when you show up with compassion, you literally transform the space of conversation, and you transform your partner for the conversation as well. And that's science for you, right? And then you transform yourself as well. There's a lot of studies coming out that show that when we're in a state of compassion, dopamine is released in our system, right? It feels good. When you're in a state of compassion, you get this boost for your immune system. When you're in a state of compassion, your brain is able to make connections between areas that hadn't been connected before. It's like the highest form of meditation. So to me, this is incredible. The fact that on one hand, we have this tendency towards polarities and aggression and defensiveness. But then we also have this immense capacity for compassion, and that's the most healing element that we can extend and offer to other people. And it's the most healing for us as well. And so think of the implications of that for ourselves and for the world. And so I want to leave you with that. And I hope that this conversation is helpful, and that next time you encounter your conflict shark, you'll be able to maybe practice it a little bit, particularly in a very heated and polarized time that we are all experiencing today. And so I want to end it with a question for all of you, really. What is a polarity that you can recognize in your own life? Where do you respond with defensiveness and with aggression? Who is your other? Who is the enemy? Is it a person? Is it a group? Is it someone on the opposite side of the political spectrum? And can you begin to extend compassion and to gift that person or that group with your listening? Are you willing to do the work? So I'd like to thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you.
Do you have any questions? Yeah.